everyone. Welcome to Macro Social Work Stories. Today, we're going to have a wonderful time as we have a conversation with two activists, two individuals who are doing some great work in Tennessee. Just going to give a brief introduction about our guests. Our first guest, is Dr. Kristie Wilder. Completed her master's in social work from the University of Tennessee, where she also received her Juris Doctorate from the Nashville School of Law. Prior to becoming a professional social worker, Dr. Wilder worked with children, adolescents, and families, community facilities, nonprofits, and government agencies. A long list of the work she's done this far. Her experience includes political social work, program development for children in states' custodies, and training for child welfare workers. That's where I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Wilder, working with child welfare training, adjusting, challenging, advocating, uplifting the system to bring about change so that our children, our young people, our needs were met and not just talked about. And so that's one thing I respect about her. She's about action. Also, her real passion lies in the notion of university community partnerships. So we're going to talk about the partnership that she's involved in with the Chattanooga Police Department. So welcome, Dr. Kristie Wilder. Our second guest that we have with us on today is Caroline Huffaker, who also serves as a Victim Services and Chaplains Director for Chattanooga Police Department. You heard it right, the police department. In 2016, she was hired by the police department and was tasked with building the very first collated victim service unit for the department. She oversees all of the advocacy services being provided to victims and survivors of crime through the Victim Services Unit and the Chaplains Program. She regularly trains both sworn, personal, and professional staff on victim-centered, survivor-led approaches in advocacy, as well as trauma-informed police and care. She has the privilege of attending Berry College, where she earned a master's in clinical mental health counseling from the UT Chattanooga, and is currently working towards a master's of public safety from the University of Virginia. And she resides in Tennessee with her husband and daughter. So welcome to Macro Social Work Stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to begin by just starting off, just tell us a little fact about yourself, something that the average person wouldn't know about you, just a fact that you want to share with our audience on today.
Whoa. Well, a little bit of my bio kind of shared that, but I am absolutely in love with community work. I think it's the heartbeat of everything that I do in the classroom. I think it's the reason that universities research should exist, that's really where action takes place. And when I look at sort of the world as it should be and the world as it is, this huge gap that I like to kind of live in. And that's where doing the justice actually happens. And so that's why I'm very excited about this conversation and excited about what the past 5 years has looked like with the Chattanooga Police Department.
Yes, so. Thank you for sharing. Our next guest, one fun fact about yourself.
Sure. Well, I feel like Kristie covered the piece about what we've been doing here at CPD, and I know we're going to get to dive into that a little bit more. So I second everything she said, but I guess personal fact, I became a parent shortly before the pandemic. So this last year has been humbling in ways that I never fully anticipated. And it's been, second, actually, I used to joke that this job was the best, hardest thing I've ever done. And now I will definitely say becoming a parent has been the best, hardest thing I've ever done. Second to, and then coming in at a close second would be the work that Kristie and I have gotten to do here at CPD with our officers and implementing direct services to victims of crime. So it's been a whirlwind, but I applaud every caring adult that loves and cares for a child. Raising a child is no small feat, and I'm grateful for all of the people that have come alongside us in this last year, especially during the pandemic, to help us figure out the ropes of parenthood. So that's a little bit about me.
Yes, thank you all for sharing. Fun fact. And you all talked about many things. As I went your bio, you all have a long experience working with communities, bringing about change. We just want to start with looking at how did this journey begin for you? Because we know that you are working now in partnership to bring about community change. But how did it all begin?
Gosh, it's funny because Kristie and I don't want to speak for her, but I certainly think neither one of us ever set out, or probably I don't even really feel like it was on either of our radars. I think when I first started at the department, we had what we affectionately call the ELERV grant, which is how we came into partnership with Kristie. And I don't even think at the time we really fully understood, the wisdom of hindsight, right? Like looking back, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense that that's the direction we headed in. But I don't think either one of us ever set out to go and do work within a police department. I know I certainly didn't. I've always been in community-based advocacy programming, particularly around intimate partner violence, sexual assault, domestic violence. And so I think, we had a very incredible leader in former Chief Fred Fletcher, who had a vision for the department that was heavy on reform and heavy on progressing the agency forward. And so I honestly think he's the beginning point, because if it hadn't have been for his vision and even applying for the grant that required us to partner with a researcher, I don't know if Kristie or I would ever have been pulled in. I'd like to think that maybe we would have, but it was really his leadership, I think, that really set the tone for what was to come at CPD.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll just add to that. That's absolutely right. It does take vision from a strong leader to kind of pull these parts together. But also there is a family justice center here in Chattanooga, and our School of Social Work is a partner at the Family Justice Center. So it's like a co-located model of different entities that address intimate partner violence. In theory, I mean, that's what the type of model that it was to be. And with us at the table, I was the School of Social Work's liaison, kind of point contact for that program on site there. And so also Chattanooga Police Department was also a partner. And I think that's sort of where that cross section, where I had the even privilege of knowing Chief Fred Fletcher and getting some idea of what they were doing. And I think that's important to mention, just because so much of what you're going to hear from us today is sort of the interdisciplinary aspect of this work and how critical that is to moving anything forward. And it really started with there being a group of interdisciplinary, backgrounds, practices, people coming together to address issues in the community. And from that, and the vision that CPD had for being more victim-centered, it just sort of was an outgrowth of all of those things. Being in the right places at the right time.
Yes. So leadership, were moving forward. They were visionaries, as well as partnerships prior to this collaboration. So leadership, partnerships, universities already partnering with community agencies to bring about justice for individuals. And so what were some of the challenges when you look at the police department and trying to look at what we could do to partner together to look at justice, trauma? So to talk about some of the challenges that you all faced as you partnered with a visionary individual, and you already had relationships prior to. And so it wasn't like someone coming from the outside trying to bring about change. So talk about that a little bit for us.
There's so many threads we could.
Sure, I know. I'm
choose a thread. A quilt will be created together.
Choose a thread. Well, maybe too, we might want to back up a little bit on that. I think just the context of this partnership it was a grant, and it was a federal level grant that came through the Chattanooga Police Department from and Caroline, of course, jump in and talk over me at any point in time. We've talked so many times about this project. If you hear us over talk each other, it's normal for us. So it came from the offices of victims of crime and funneled through the IACP down to the Chattanooga Police Department. So we were under the directive of, a grant, a federal level grant. And so I would say right there's already some challenges, because you have levels of communication with individuals who are not, in your state, much less in your city or in either of your agencies. And you have project managers and then project managers of project managers. And so there were layers of communication that I will say from the outset, especially coming in as the research partner in this project, because that was my role. I was not internal to Chattanooga Police Department. I was to be, sort of an objective third party part of this process. And so I didn't know the culture of the Chattanooga Police Department. I don't know like who's lieutenant chief, who am I going to offend today when we sit there in our advisory meetings? And it's like, I don't know what they are and what comes next. And I still would hate to be quizzed over these things. And so I think that was initially just understanding who's on first, who do I communicate with, the basics of kind of doing the work, to be honest. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to add to that, but that was, and knowing what they actually wanted us to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, for law enforcement, they're very used to quantitative research. They like numbers, they like stats, and where we actually, and we had a quantitative research partner, the late Dr. Vic Bumpus. He did our quantitative research for us, but actually where we really dug in as an agency was the qualitative. And again, I think it comes back to what you were saying about leadership. We had leadership that was very interested. The quantitative was helpful, and that data is valid and good and necessary. And so I always explain to people the quantitative data showed us that we had problems. The qualitative data showed us where our problems were and the extent of them and the depth of them because of the nature of qualitative data. I think the challenge that came with that, among some other things, was that's inherently vulnerable work, is to hear why your community doesn't like you, or the ways that you're falling short. And so that takes humility and vulnerability. And culturally, when you dig into law enforcement, vulnerability, when you tell them something about vulnerability or you say the word vulnerable, they automatically in their head think about physical vulnerability because they do everything in their practices to be not physically vulnerable, because that can have implications for them, their safety, the person that they're working with. They're always looking for physical vulnerabilities out in the world. But because they're always searching for those physical vulnerabilities, what we were asking them to do was to go to relational and emotional, mental, and in some aspects, spiritual vulnerability places with their community and within themselves. And that's something that, traditionally speaking, law enforcement as a profession hasn't always explored. Unlike all you wonderful, fine folks and practitioners, I am not a social worker. I have a degree in counseling, which is social work adjacent, right? Like we're siblings, if you will.
You're still a good person.
Well, you're letting me hang out, which is great.
Yeah,
Today, so thank you.
There are people.
So, but when I look and when I look at, it's the work that you do in the individual therapeutic setting, right? Like there has to be the desire for change, the modicum for change. And, we were asking them to do that as an organization and as people. And so we were met with some pushback, right? The idea that someone would be challenging their effectiveness as a department is hard. And so, and those are new and scary things to ask them to engage in things that are really common in our fields, right? We're so used to some of these soft skills in our work. And so I had to really slow down. Kristie and Vic were doing the research part, and I was taking the data and then implementing direct interventions to address the disparities in the data. And I had to slow down as the delivery person of that and realize what I was asking them to do was new and scary. And just like any other client that I would have worked with in a therapeutic setting, I needed to slow down to their pace and realize that it's easier for them to say, I don't like this. This is for lack of a better word, this is stupid, this is dumb, whatever, all you touchy-feely folks. What was really back behind there was, this is new, this is scary, and I don't know if I'm going to be good at it.
How did you overcome? Were you able to overcome some of that? Have you been able to overcome some of that?
Depending on the day, no.
And I would say,
yeah,
I would say one of the things that's critical here, though, is yes, there was some of those that would, who felt really vulnerable. But the amazing thing, and what has truly made all of this work, is that leadership. So we mentioned Chief Fletcher, but now we have Chief Roddy, who has been the chief for the past almost 4
years.
Yeah. So he took over immediately following Chief Fletcher, and his vulnerability and what he models and his vulnerability is off the charts. And so what I would have maybe in my bias expected to see as a challenge was covering up the things that our data was revealing. But instead he was like, give me more. Like, I want to understand why they said this. And that means we need to track back to their, field training officer to understand and change culture rather than giving the right answers. And so the vulnerability that came and still comes from Chief Roddy is unprecedented. I think that Chattanooga really has a treasure in that, and this opportunity for change and working in the agency. And so while, I think it still exists where Caroline is talking about, absolutely it does. At the same time, we were able to get through that and make some progress because there was tremendous support and modeling of that from the executive level.
Yeah, that's a big deal. To stay with that, intimate partner violence, when there are calls for somebody to intervene, the data nationally shows they're disproportionately dangerous for whoever shows up. So how does that work? Is your program involved in that as a partner with the police? Do they do it individually and then refer people to you? How does that work?
Sure. So there's a couple of different avenues. So we, our unit, so when we first started, it was just me. I was a unit of one, big whopping staff of one. And then now we've grown to, we have six full-time staff, myself included. Yeah. And along with, we typically take anywhere from 1 to 3, typically they're MSWs, but we're open to having like counseling, students or, criminal justice, but we typically have MSWs with us. And so as interns during their clinical field placement. And so we have some advocates that are assigned to investigations, and they carry on and follow up with long-term investigations. And so we'll cover things like survivors of homicide coming along, so those families that have lost a loved one due to a homicide or a vehicular homicide. I just assigned out one of those today. All the way to we have patrol-based advocates who go out and respond in real time, very much to what you just described, to the calls that officer that they're riding with that day responds to. So it could be something like an intimate partner violence call. And so they are on scene with the officers. We do have some protocols in place that once the scene is deemed safe and it's okay for that staff member to get out onto scene and work with the identified victim or victims of that call, they will be able to then work with them. We're also fortunate in that we have a very robust domestic violence shelter program. And as Kristie said, we have an FJC. So we also practice what's called the lethality assessment protocol, which is the LAP. So it's essentially a way of trying to assess lethality in our domestic violence and intimate partner violence cases, so that if that victim ranks high, essentially on that lethality assessment, they have an automatic spot in shelter should they wish. Again, they get to volunteer or voluntarily go into a shelter placement, but they'll automatically have no barrier that would impede them from getting to a safe spot that day or that evening. And so our staff works with the officer to make sure that they get screened in with our community partners should the lethality indicate that they need that. If not, we'll do follow-up afterwards. And so in addition to the intimate partner cases, robberies, burglaries, traffic incidents, ag assaults, non-fatal shootings, we are what's called generalists at our agency. So we cover all crime types. at CPD.
How does the Social Justice Center work? How is that? You mentioned that, Kristie, at the beginning, and Caroline, you just mentioned it too.
Mm-hmm.
How's that integrated into the work or into the community?
I think the Lights On program is a perfect example of social justice. So, and actually the dashboard. So one of the things that Chief Roddy has been doing in the department is being more transparent. All of the data, statistics of traffic stops, crime, all of that, you can go online and see the data. There's nothing that they're keeping from the community. And so that level of accountability is allowed for people to see kind of the, correlations between who is getting pulled over for traffic stops and why are they being pulled over. So for instance, if you were pulled over for a broken taillight, Chief Roddy has found a best practice where instead of getting a traffic ticket, you get a voucher to go to a mechanic and get your car fixed for free, basically. Sort of trying to reduce, this criminalizing poverty that we so often talk about. That's important to address. And by being out there with the data, it allows for not only that accountability, but opportunity to change practices within the agencies. I think that's one of the really great examples happening in terms of social justice with the police department here.
I think because, the reality when we talk about releasing data and information from our department, we're very much of the mindset of, one way forward that when we work with other law enforcement agencies, we encourage them to think about is just radical transparency. And, the reality is you're a public service agency. That information certainly is a public record and folks could put in a FOIA request for that with the Freedom of Information Act or their Open Records Acts for their specific state. But the reality is I think it's a human nature or just our natural inclination is when there is a lack of information, we tend to backfill it with what we think we know. And so if you go ahead and just supply the data and supply the information and then invite people into the conversation with you, particularly if there's areas that you need to work on. I remember last summer during all of the civil unrest and the protests that were going on, Chief Roddy sent out an email to the department basically encouraging folks to have hard conversations. And he basically said, our profession is changing and needs to change. And wouldn't you want to be a part of that conversation? And encouraging officers to have the moral courage, not just the physical courage to go out and do their jobs, but the moral courage to engage in those conversations because they're happening. And so I think as they should be, and so I think with, to Kristie's point about the data, it was an invitation for us to invite our community in and say, we're doing the hard work of looking at ourselves. And like Kristie said, we found a statistically significant difference finding in across the board pretty equitably. We were ticketing folks for safety infractions. If you're speeding, you're speeding. You're going to get a ticket. That was pretty equitable across the board. But what we did find was those economic infractions that Kristie alluded to, your taillights out, your windshield's cracked. We were disproportionately ticketing folks from Black and brown communities and communities of color at a higher rate. And so that's when Chief Roddy was like, all right, that's where our work is. We've got to figure out why is that happening? What training needs to happen, policy shifts, what recruiting tactics need to shift? Are we not asking the right questions in our recruiting? So from that one data set gives us multiple areas to explore as an agency to figure out what practices all the way around are we utilizing and where are they not working and how are we going to fix that and address it? And so that's where we came across the Lights On campaign, which is a national campaign, and partnering with, public and private sector partnership or partnering with garages across the city to have that voucher program to try and decriminalize. And then also it's shifting the conversation with officers around what's the importance of this program, because then they're like, well, why are we giving out tickets for this? And it's then a conversation starter for us internally, for us to have at a leadership down the ranks level to figure out, well, can you understand why? Have you considered this? So on and so forth.
Well, Kristie, Gary, any follow-up questions? I don't want to just ask all the questions here.
I was wondering, back on the LAP, right? Acronym,
Yes.
right?
Yep, correct.
What percentage of those who call in end up ranking high enough for an immediate shelter space?
You know, I don't know the specific statistic, and I can run it and get it for you. I would say, you know, just anecdotally speaking, maybe a quarter of them. But again, that's assuming that folks, and there's a lot of, you know, when we watch, some officers are better at administering, it's an assessment basically. So some officers are better at administering that assessment.
Right.
And so, which I think has implications for how people answer. So I think that I'd be interested to see, you know, if we really wanted to take a deep dive and figure out, you know, how accurate even is that anecdotal statistic. I'm happy to get that information for you if you're really wanting a specific.
I was just curious because I like it in theory, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think that's great insight. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of factors as to how accurate of a representation is that. I think at the end of the day, because we constantly are working with the officers on, don't read it like a checklist. Like, it's teaching them social work and counseling skills, right? You know, when I was in graduate school, I had a whole semester on assessments and had to learn how to give them and interpret them and work through them with folks. And even though this is a 12-item assessment, it's an assessment nonetheless, and one that's taking a deep dive at people's personal history of trauma and abuse. And so, you know, when you look at the history of the LAP, it was developed with cops in mind. So there's an argument that could be made for, is it time for us to relook at even that assessment and how we're asking those questions? So it's a great tool. But like most assessments, you could probably find something.
Well, I'm assuming they have, you know, some kind of training on, and I don't know what the questions are, but is there a pause when she or he answers? Is there, you know, hesitation, that sort of thing, where despite their answers, they may be reading something different in the situation. Is there a spot for them? Is there a text box for them to add notes? Yeah.
Observations. Yeah. There's a spot, and they receive training on it. But as a person who regularly trains our officers, it is a challenge too. This is which I'm sure you all in academia too understand. Teaching and training is a challenge across the board because everyone learns differently. So, but yeah, some of those nonverbals or those other things to pick up on are certainly something we want them to be wary of.
Yeah. So this collaboration sounds like a paradigm shift. And because of the paradigm shift, they had to do some reflection of how we're perceived. And when you're perceived a certain way, sometimes it can be shocking. And so the data that was provided to this collaboration allowed the police department to engage differently with communities. Some communities historically have been hesitant to even partner with this system many times. And so engagement, reflection, all these are different things that really could bring about change, sustainable change, and having leadership who are visionary, who are being transparent. And transparency is not something we experience in our nation. And so as a result of what I hear you all saying about transparency, we're seeing growth where data guides the fact that you all are giving out vouchers so that we don't continue to create a system of criminalized poverty for some people. That's a game changer. But for the police department in Chattanooga, we're saying that we want to try something different because what we're doing may not be as progressive. And so
go ahead, Gary. I'm sorry.
And so because we understand that what we're doing is not progressive, not working, maybe we want to change some things. in that process. And so what I hear you all saying is that you all are speaking to other police departments about the great work that you are doing in Chattanooga. Is that what I hear you saying?
Correct. We enjoy providing technical assistance. We've had the privilege of being asked to give presentations for the Center for Victim Research, for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, for their various different programs and partnerships that they have about this research partner PD relationship that we have going on, and a lot of the changes that we've made at CPD. And so, we're an open book. We enjoy very much telling other law enforcement agencies the challenges we've had, because again, I think, we were, myself and a captain were on a call with an agency recently that's been in the news. And, I just said, encouraged them that it's hard work. It's not going to change overnight. We're just now where we are. And here we are 6 years into 6 years into this endeavor here at CPD. And I think folks think that if they are struggling to implement change, if it's challenging or hard, that sometimes I think the messaging that we tell ourselves is we're doing it wrong, or this isn't working. And the reality is if it's a struggle and if you're really challenging because you're really confronting your agency with some of the practices and philosophies and mindsets, then you're doing it right. Hard, just because something's hard doesn't mean that it's not good and not worth doing. And so we try really hard to let agencies know that it's worth doing in every sense of the word, because your community deserves that level of service. But also I think there's selfishly too, there's some fulfillment that comes from being able to hang your hat at the end of the day and say, I feel really good about the work that we did as an agency. And so it can improve morale. It can improve internal organizational operations. So I think certainly we do it externally to serve those that they've taken an oath to serving, but also internally what it does for us as an organization and for us as human beings.
Kristie Wilder, from where you sit with your data, what are the changes that you've seen in the data over time that speak to this kind of slow yet important change that's obviously begun to happen in Chattanooga?
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how we set up. So as was already noted, I was the qualitative researcher. So in the first year when we came in, we were just kind of looking at what is it that we need to know and who do we need to know it from, which is, of course, the most important question, I think, who provides us that information. And as we began to talk about our community, we decided really it was the victims. It was the victims who needed to give us input on how the police department was serving them. But then we also wanted that to be very representative. And so I had no idea exactly how difficult this was going to become as we started to design the focus groups to go out into the community. I knew it would take an incredible level of engagement, but social work, that's what we do. We engage communities. And so I thought, I had a ridiculous timeline that I started with, and I can say it doubled. It took twice as long and probably twice as many resources as I anticipated, but it was well worth it because we were able to get focus groups within the Latinx community, within the African-American community, with our senior citizens and our queer community. But I will say that one, I'll put a pin there. That was an incredibly difficult community to tap into, which I think sometimes you have to look at what you don't get from the data and figure out what it's telling you. And I believe that, there had been a lot of mistrust happening there between the police department and the queer community. And then also just within their community, they didn't have a lot of trust with each other. So it was really hard to bring them together to share openly and vulnerably. So we got some data from them, but it was not a huge sample size. And then we did one specifically with intimate partner, those who were survivors of partner violence. So this was a great sample. I mean, we actually, for qualitative, we had 45 participants in this stage, so it gave us quite a good feedback. And we went to where they were. So we knew this was going to be hard to get them to talk and to trust. So we, one of the groups that we met with was just family members who had lost loved ones to gang violence and understanding their experience with the police department. And that was one of those, very sobering groups, and you began to understand the struggle of losing a loved one in gang violence and how different the grief process looks because of how different the response was from everyone. There's no respect and dignity for your loved one. They're treated more as a perpetrator than a victim. And so we learned a lot from just listening in the community to these stories. Over and over again. Well, so let me say in the African-American community, there was incredible pushback at first of like even talking. They're like, we've been talking for years. Nobody's listened. Why talk now? Why share now? What we want is we want our officers to show up, police our community, know us, be here, even when, you're not arresting us or, so they did share some harrowing stories in terms of their experience and relationship with the police department or with some officers, I should say. But I went into places like barbershops and wherever they were and spent sometimes an hour with them talking before they would even share and open up. So I feel like by the time we got the data, it was pretty real and honest. This was our first round of data that we presented. And when we were talking about the vulnerability, I think my mind usually goes to this first year because, I shared direct quotes with the executive staff and also our grant funders of what the community was saying that they were experiencing. And it was incredibly hard to hear, it was one thing for me to share that as an outsider and just an objective evaluator, but I knew that it was big stuff that we were sharing. So that pool of data kind of gave us a snapshot of where needs were, like how training needed to be shifted within the department, maybe policy changes that needed to happen, and just a level of engagement with the officers that had not happened. Because interestingly enough, with the quantitative surveys that were going on, when we overlaid that with the qualitative, so we asked the victims, how are the officers doing? Mm-hmm. And we got a lot of not so great in these areas. And then we asked the officers how they're doing in those areas, and they said, fantastic. We're great. Out of the park. So that was a big, the coming and reconciling those two different data sets was where Caroline got to have a lot of fun in her job because it was, tasked her with having to figure out how to embed all of that into training. And as we began to look at training, this sort of moved us into the next 2, 3, 4 years, taking always with us the voices of the victims into everything that we did from that point on. I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out, like, how do you build these things into training? I mean, these officers are trained to death, I was not ever under this, false assumption that as a social worker, I could come in and change, police officers just because I came in with this magical, like, we should all get along. And so I was always very aware of my role and my position and tried to do a lot of digging deeper for how we could integrate this, not like what is it Fred always said, trick them, teach them.
Yeah, we say trick them, teach them.
Yeah, we trick them, teach them. But this is where we landed on the poverty simulation, recognizing that some of the disparities were just a result of officers not having any exposure to poverty and the intersectionality of poverty and race, and how easy, just with unthinking through your bias lens, it is to criminalize poverty because you've never been confronted with that as a human. And so that's when Caroline and I proposed the poverty simulation to embed that into the police academy with all new incoming cadets. And this, again, goes back and is a nod to leadership, because it's a huge thing to come in and say, hey, in police academy where you're teaching, all the technical skills, like how to shoot a gun, can we have a half a day of your training to do a poverty simulation? And the response was a resounding, "This is fantastic." And some of the executive staff participated in the first poverty simulation. I think we had like 85 participants in our first.
Yeah.
Wow. So with the Chattanooga Police Department and the community coming together. And then we break into, breakout discussion groups after the poverty simulation. And we've had experiences where these cadets sometimes break down and cry because they grew up in poverty. And to cry in front of your future fellow, law enforcement officers is a really big deal to kind of make that, I don't know, I mean, almost a culture shift before they're part of the culture. And so we have now done, I think 6 poverty simulations.
6, and we're getting ready to do, I think, our 7th.
Yeah. In 2 weeks, we'll do our 7th one. And so that's just a part of Police Academy. It's on their schedule. It's expected. And, and that kind of goes back to that social justice piece you were talking about. That certainly is an opportunity where we can talk
definitely.
about sort of issues when we process
so it's really interesting what you're both doing. It's like you've started to do something related to reimagining police community safety before 2020, before George Floyd, before Breonna Taylor, before how do you now, I'm sure, I mean, as you both know, defund the police is out there, and yet it sounds like the work that went out, I certainly have looked at Movement for Black Lives, and they often talk about reimagining safety and not just defund. How do you respond? What has the response been in Chattanooga on this? And as I said, it sounds to me like there's a lot of reimagining what policing could be, that not only what policing can be, but what social work's doing in relationship to that. It's like you're ahead of the curve here.
Well, we've definitely talked about that a lot, like how interesting, the climate is now from where we started. And because so many times when you're doing the research and the work, it's not public until towards the end. And so, we have been misunderstood sometimes by folks who say it's in response to everything that's going on. We're like, no, we've been doing this now. Like, this has been 6 years really since it started. So you're absolutely right. It's merging into a very interesting time. And I'm going to speak for a moment just as a social worker. I can only speak from that perspective. I am certainly not embedded in the law enforcement agency. I came into this work with the police department with a ton of bias. So, early on, Caroline mentioned that neither of us saw, ourselves going in this direction. If anyone had told me, you should do social work to work with a bunch of police officers, I would have never signed up for social work. I mean, that's just, sometimes you look and go like, how did I get here? And yet you're exactly where you're supposed to be. So that I've had to work through, right? So I'm the teacher of all things, work through your bias. Don't have any bias, students. And concurrently, I was going through a real experience of confronting that. And so and now here I am knowing officers as people, right? So we say this all the time, like, well, if you knew somebody who was gay, you couldn't treat him that way. Or if you knew, if you had that one Black friend, you wouldn't treat him like this. And the reality is that that's the same for me. If I needed to know officers. I needed to see them as humans and remember the amount of trauma that they're exposed to in their work and, kind of drill down on what's going on to be able to do some of the deeper work. With that said, am I in denial that there's work to be done and that there's injustices? Am I on the front lines, these protests and deeply involved in following them? Absolutely. But I just don't think it's as simple as defunding. And part of that, I've gone to a lot of trainings this past year that have been put on by wonderful social work, entities and associations. And a lot of times I invite Caroline, like we do a lot of cross training between our two disciplines. And I'll be honest, part of what I'm beginning to hear and see within the social work profession is sort of this where we're creating categories of us and them. And this is a basic, I mean, we all know this. We teach our students this, like the in and out groups, right? And so I was so dying to go to a training that helped me to understand how to call out the injustices and be a part of the work in an interdisciplinary fashion. And what I often leave with from my own people is this idea that it's us against them in this work. And usually it's social workers are the in group and officers are, are the out group. And I just have a really hard time reconciling that. And I am sure it comes with this experience I've had for the past 6 years of kind of reducing the worth of that out group, which is the antithesis to everything that we espouse in our code of ethics. And so, yeah, I think it's really important. I think it's something that we as a profession really need to reckon with, because I will say, when you look at the millions and millions of people that social workers interact with on a daily basis, we haven't eradicated poverty yet. Like I would hate for somebody to look at that and say, defund social workers, So I really want to get to that deeper layer of what we're saying when we say defund the police. I think throwing money at social service agencies isn't going to fix it, because we've been, no, our program's well-funded, no, but I think there's deeper issues in each of these areas that we need to look at. Like, what would that mean if we just are throwing money around into different places? Yeah. I think we absolutely need to bring accountability. And I'm a big proponent of that. And I think statistics show us a big part of the story here. And we have disproportionate treatment happening by law enforcement. But man, the work is so much deeper than that. And we do it together. I think interdisciplinary work is really where it's at. I didn't come into this as a subject matter expert at all. I did bring my social work skills, which, I think are tremendous asset. But I need the Carolines and I need the officers teaching me the subject matter that they are, embedded in. And so that's where I'm at on defund the police.
That's helpful.
That's a very brief version of that, but we as a profession have to, I think, reconcile a little bit more too with our work in this.
We're getting close to wrap up time. So certainly, Kristie, that's a great place for you to be able to. And Caroline, I know we'd like you to be able to wrap up for yourself as well before we sign off. Obviously, we could do this one, Dr. Jones, more than once. So I'm sure we'll have you back. But Caroline, we always want you all to have the last word.
Sure. Well, I guess building off of what Kristie said, I think, I try to live my life in nuance. I think that's honestly where life really should be lived, is life is both and not either or. And I absolutely believe that there is work for law enforcement to be done. There's a reckoning that needs to happen in the profession as a whole. There's an estimated 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and Chattanooga Police Department is just one. And I feel very committed and passionate to helping other law enforcement agencies at all sizes, small, mid-size, and large municipalities, discover the magic, essentially, of interdisciplinary work. But I think, what I would submit to communities is that, very much like the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, real change and enduring change happens one step at a time. And it happens often a little bit slower than we want. But I think when we live our lives in these pendulums of, okay, we're going to move things over here now and move things over there. And in the moment that may feel like we have done something, but to move the needle really in the progress in the direction that you're wanting, it takes time. And I think a lot of change happens in relational proximity. I can recognize that also too, being internally, I have gotten to know a lot of our officers. And some of them, I'm not necessarily inviting over to my house for dinner. Some of them I'm professional and courteous, and I use every opportunity to teach. And then there are some that obviously I have good, close working relationships with. And I can also recognize that I've been through some stuff with our officers over the last 6 years. I had a conversation with another professional right as everything was happening last summer, and she was, you know, very much of the mindset of abolish the police. And she said there are no good cops. And, you know, and I can recognize this was my own stuff that I was trying to unpack and express to her. But, you know, a couple years ago, I responded out on scene to a school bus crash where we had 6 elementary school children killed. And I watched our officers do things that I just don't think people understand. And then to be given no room and no opportunity to, and no tools, right? Like I went to graduate school for counseling. I understand therapeutic modalities and techniques, and I very much enjoy my own personal counselor that I go see for self-care. But that field and that profession of, you know, how do you return tiny backpacks to bereaved families and then go home to your own families and figure out how to process that with your better half or your families? Honestly, truly speaking, I don't want to speak in generalizations. Cops haven't been taught that. And so when I see things happening in the community, we exist in multitudes, right? There's so many layers to our behavior, externally out in the community and internally as officers. And so I wish that we could just slow down and help each other unpack that. And I think, again, that's where interdisciplinary work really, really works, because there are things that I feel like as a profession, officers have absorbed from Kristie and I or our practices that have made them better officers. And then I would be lying if I said there are things that officers have taught me that have made me a better practitioner. Officers are very direct in their communication, and me as a trained counselor tends to be very effusive and flowery. And sometimes we can also get into gender dynamics with that of, you know, women, it's harder for us to say no, and where does that come from as a societal norm and all of this. And, you know, law enforcement has taught me to be very direct and clear in my communication, kind but direct, which in a lot of ways is more helpful. To not give mixed messaging to a victim who really just needs to hear the truth of what's going on, or you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, I guess all that to say, you know, we just believe wholeheartedly in the work that we've done. We really think that it is an avenue forward, because I hear a lot of defund or abolish or reform. And in some places I hear really interesting ways forward, but I don't want to be so arrogant as to think that our work is a way forward, but I guess I just believe in it so much that I really think it is. I think that this model of interdisciplinary work is potentially what that, as you said, reimagination could look like.
That's great.
I don't know if this is, you know, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but I will say one data set that it was an unofficial one that we've been looking at is our clearance rates, the rate at which we solve and clear our cases, particularly homicides, has grown exponentially since we started all of this. And so when we're working with other law enforcement agencies, we explain to them that the amount of trust that your community has in you is we believe directly reflected in your clearance rate. So if you have a low clearance rate, that means your community does not trust you, is not willing to engage, is not willing to come forward. And so when we started in 2016, our homicide clearance rate was 41%. The national average is generally about 60. And we generally end most years, in 2018, I'm looking at it, we ended in 87%, 2019, 72%, 2020, 70%, and this year we're at 85%.
Gary, want to bring us home?
Yes, we thank our guests for sharing their story, our macro social work stories, collaboration, having visionary leaders to bring about change, understanding that we cannot work in silos. Working in silos, you can't get the rich data to change engagement. But understanding that systems, that historical, there's some biases that we all bring to the table, historical experiences, lived experiences from vulnerable communities that are hesitant to come to the table. But when we engage, take time, hear their story, over time, all members will be at the table for next generation. Many people over the last year or two have just been aware of police brutality. But if you live in America And if you're on the front lines, you have to realize that this is not anything new. And so instead of talking about it, what can we do to bring about change? And so I want to thank you all for bringing about the change process, not just talking about the problem. It's easy to talk, but we want to bring about change in that process. Thank you all for coming. And we look forward to having you back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.